Here we're going to look at topic 63, example 3, where we identify positive or negative intervals. So the question, for what intervals is f of x equal to x squared minus 9? This should actually say, let's make this fix, x squared minus 4. This graph is for x squared minus 4, so sorry about that. But the question, for what intervals is f of x equal to x squared minus 4 positive? For what intervals is the function negative? So to determine positive and negative intervals, we want to look at the graph and we want to focus on the x-axis. All right, we have this x-axis here and we want to look at the parts of the graph that are above that and the parts of the graph that are below that. So we're looking ultimately at the y values and we want to know, when are the y values positive above the graph, when are they negative below the graph. So this portion of the graph right here is above the x-axis, and this portion of the graph is also above the x-axis. So positive intervals are above the x-axis, all right, when that y is positive. Negative intervals are below the x-axis, and that would be an interval down here. Right, this is below the x-axis. So to label these, we're going to use interval notation. I've mentioned this a couple times in the previous videos, and then go from there. So for the positive ones, let's start with positive. So it looks like we have two positive intervals, one on the top left section of the graph and one on the top right section. So positive intervals. All right, we know that the numbers over here, so in this piece here, we have the values where x is less than negative 2. So positive intervals, we know x is less than negative 2. All right, it's not equal to it because when it's equal, it's right on the axis, and we don't want to consider that positive or negative because it's right along the axis. So we know that it's x is less than negative 2, and then over here, it's when x is greater than positive 2. So that would be x is greater than positive 2. Now that's not interval notation, that's just kind of notes that we're taking for ourselves. So in terms of interval notation, how do we show, actually let me put that here. X is greater than 2. All right, so interval notation. To show x is less than negative 2, well, what's the minimum? The lowest number? Well, that's going to go all the way down to negative infinity, right? And then the max number would be negative 2. We need to then decide whether we want to use brackets or parentheses. For this specific example, remember, we want above the x-axis. This negative 2 point is right on the x-axis, so that would not be included as part of the positive interval, so we're going to say a parenthesis. X is greater than 2, kind of the same idea, but this time the lowest value would be 2, right? We're starting at that value of 2, and again, right at 2 is the x-axis, so we don't want to include 2, we just want to use that as a boundary, and that's going to increase forever to positive infinity, which infinity symbols will always have parentheses. So the positive intervals would be negative infinity to negative 2 and 2 to infinity. Now the negative interval we only have one of them here. All right, and that looks like it goes from negative 2 to positive 2. All right, it's between those two numbers, right? So again, I've mentioned it a couple times already. We don't actually want to include those values because they're right on the x-axis. That won't be positive or negative. We want below. So the lowest number would be negative 2. Actually, let me rephrase that. Let's say the minimum. Let's use our math terms. So the minimum would be negative 2, and the maximum would be 2. So that means as a negative interval, we would want from negative 2 to 2 in an interval notation, and then we would need to decide parentheses or brackets. Final time I'm going to say this. It's right on the x-axis. So -2 and +2 are not included in the intervals. So that means we're going to use parentheses. Let's just highlight our answers. So the negative interval would be -2 to 2. And that is it. So the key thing here, the key takeaway, is this piece right here. Our positive intervals are above the x-axis and our negative intervals are below the x-axis. If you can remember that, once you get the actual graph using a program like Desmos or using a graphing calculator, then you're just looking at where your function or graph crosses the x-axis, and that'll help you determine the positive and negative intervals. Shouldn't be too difficult. Students tend to do pretty well at this, so hopefully that's the case for you.